Archetypes. Where are we taking the West we live in? Where do we want to take it? The answer to that question is tightly connected to a concept that, honestly, all of us should understand better. Archetypes. I'm not talking only in the Jungian sense. I mean archetypes as a principle. The deep images, the deep roles, the deep scripts that shape how a civilization imagines the world and how it imagines itself. And right now, there are a couple of artistic audiovisual works I want you to watch, if you can. Frankenstein and Dracula. Because through these two stories, we can understand a lot about what I mean by archetypes. Take Frankenstein. Guillermo del Toro has translated Mary Shelley's extraordinary narrative into cinema. Everyone knows the basic story, Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. But this adaptation, in my opinion, captures the deepest soul of that story. It captures a transitional phase the West went through in the 1800s. That esoteric, occult, even satanic 19th century. We forget the atmosphere Mary Shelley was immersed in. She was formed inside a very specific intellectual climate. Her father was William Godwin, one of the early fathers of modern anarchism. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the early founders of modern feminism. And in London, around certain editorial circles, there were gatherings where people experimented with ideas that today sound extreme, but that were real currents in that era. A kind of Gnostic inversion, a theory where Lucifer is framed as the positive principle and Yahweh as the negative principle. You find echoes of that in William Blake too, and he wasn't far from those environments. So Mary Shelley is, in a sense, a daughter of that Gnostic, satanic trajectory that takes shape in the West between the late 1700s and the 1800s. It runs alongside the French Revolution, and it searches for something, a new heroic model, a new archetype of the hero. Because the ancient hero, classical heroism, was fundamentally sacrificial. The hero offered himself for a greater good. Whatever the good was, whatever the sacrifice was, the hero recognized the sacred. But modern revolutions, first the English, then the French, needed a different kind of hero. A hero who doesn't bow to the sacred, but fights it. And here's the key moment. With the Puritan world and the English revolutionary atmosphere, you get Milton's Paradise Lost. Milton was tied to that revolutionary environment, to Cromwell's world. And he writes a story about Adam and Eve. But the character that ends up becoming sympathetic, the one that later centuries find fascinating, is Lucifer, Satan. From there, across the 1600s and 1700s, art, painting, literature begin to develop a new iconography, the rebellious anti-God hero. And in the 1800s, this becomes a dominant archetype. It becomes the protagonist of modern narratives. Frankenstein is a child of that. Mary Shelley becomes an alchemical vessel for this transformation, a place where that archetype takes form, becomes flesh, enters the imagination of the masses. Because what is Frankenstein really? And especially, what is Victor Frankenstein? Victor is the modern magician. He inherits Faust, another story about the devil, another story about the pact with the devil. But now everything is reworked in modern terms. There is work on flesh. The creature is built out of flesh. And there is work on technique, on technology, on the advancing power of method. Mary Shelley is asking, what happens to our values when technique explodes? What happens to the worldview that held the West together? Something collapses. The old archetypes dissolve. The West, as it knew itself, begins to melt. I've called that process in my own language, a kind of 19th century nigredo. the alchemical blackening, the breaking down, the decomposition. And then you have the avant-garde and the 20th century pushing this to a climax, destroying what came before, breaking the inherited images, burning the old archetypal center. Now here, Del Toro's film captures something essential, something that is more explicit in the film than in the book. The hatred of the father. There is an underground intent in that era, the desire to destroy the father. And when you destroy the father, you destroy three things at once: the biological father, the social father, and the heavenly father. That was precisely the dream inside those Gnostic inversion circles: to overthrow the bad god and replace him with the good divinity, a Manichaean fantasy. And in many ways, they succeeded. So when you watch Frankenstein, you're not watching a museum piece. You're watching a mirror. You are watching the present. We are the extreme point of that process, Dalila. Now look at the other narrative that is circulating again. The vampire. Dracula. Different style, different aesthetic. But it also captures a dynamic. Collapse and epilogue. The conclusion of Western identity as we knew it. And symbolically, it's fascinating that Frankenstein and Dracula are born together. They emerge from the same esoteric weekend around Lord Byron. Two stories rise from the same atmosphere, one about flesh and one about blood. Do you see how Christian symbolism remains? But inverted, the story of the 19th and 20th century West is, in many ways, a total inversion. White becomes black, sacred becomes profaned, identity becomes self-hatred. And this is where the archetype matters. Because today, many of the movements we see, culturally, ideologically, politically, are movements of division. They split man from woman. They split human from the divine. They split rich from poor and set them against each other. They build narratives with a victim and an executioner. And all of this fits perfectly inside a modern heroic archetype that is self-destructive. The truly modern hero, the hero produced by these dynamics, is a hero who mainly does one thing. He hates himself. He hates his father. He hates his identity. He hates his homeland. And then the question becomes unavoidable. Where is the West going? If the archetypes that have been planted in us are these, then the West moves toward its own end. And yes, there's even a strange truth in the word West. In the West, the sun sets. There's a built-in sense of sunset, of decline, of decadence. That melancholy is part of Western identity. But should we be alarmed? In one sense, yes. Because certain drifts of our era have led to something extreme. The West is moving toward demographic and spiritual extinction. People don't have children. Many Westerners are immersed in a culture of self-hatred, or convinced they are the cause of all the world's evils. You hear it constantly. We did colonialism. We enslaved. We committed terrible things. Some of that is true. But this narrative conveniently forgets something basic. Every civilization has done violence when it had power. There is no innocent tribe in history. The human being has darkness inside. And it belongs to everyone. That's why working with archetypes matters. Because archetypes lead you back to a hard truth. You are not pure light. You are also mud. In the Judeo-Christian story, the human being carries both. A reflection of God, image and likeness, and at the same time a nature shaped from dust. That's beautiful, and it's demanding. And here is one of the West's biggest problems today. especially among younger generations, that we can't process the idea that human beings can be evil. For 2 or 3 generations after World War II, we've been sheltered from the rawest dynamics of existence, from war, and that's a blessing. But it also produced a strange fragility. We no longer understand violence as a human constant. When we see violence, for us, it's either a video game or a movie. Real violence shocks us because it's outside our imagination. But for most of human history, violence was normal. It was part of the natural condition. So how do we bring the West towards something more fertile, more alive? We bring it back to truth. And truth has become a taboo word. But we need to place it at the center again. And to return to truth, we must begin with the most immediate, the most brutal truth. The truth of the senses. The truth of the body. Salvation begins with the body. In Christianity, the body is crucified, but it is the body that rises. God chooses a body to become incarnate. So we have to start here. Concreteness. Bodies. A physical awareness of ourselves. A life that is less cerebral, less imprisoned by thoughts and technologies, and more devoted to the truth of our embodied life. That's where I believe salvation begins. Yeah, I started this as a free-form reflection. If you like it, I'll continue and make more. Follow this channel. You already know where to find me. Comment, tell me what you think, suggest topics, and may God bless all of us.